April 12, 1945. Somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, a 14-year-old boy sits in a bombed-out basement, writing by the light of a candle stub. His handwriting is careful, the way children write when they want adults to take them seriously. The pencil trembles in his small fingers as he forms each letter. Dear Mama, they gave me a rifle bigger than me. It's so heavy I can barely lift it, but they say I'm a soldier now. Do you think I look like a soldier? I can't see myself in any mirrors here. They're all broken. The letter was written by Klaus Hoffman, a boy who should have been sitting in a mathematics class, worrying about homework and wondering if the girl with pigtails liked him back. Instead, he was holding a weapon designed for grown men, wearing a uniform that hung loose on his skeletal frame, preparing to die for a cause he couldn't possibly understand. This letter, discovered 76 years later in the Berlin State Archives, represents one of the most haunting documents to emerge from the final days of World War II. It provides a child's perspective on the systematic militarization of Germany's youth, when boys barely tall enough to see over a trench parapet were handed rifles and told to defend a collapsing empire with their lives. The document forces us to confront one of warfare's most disturbing aspects: the transformation of children into instruments of violence. Klaus's words reveal not just the mechanics of child recruitment, but the psychological cost of forcing innocence to carry the weight of adult hatred and fear. Don't let this story be forgotten. Subscribe to keep these memories alive. Klaus Hoffman's letter begins with the mundane concerns of a child trying to maintain connection with normalcy. He asks about his younger sister, whether she's been practicing piano, if his dog Fritz still sleeps on his bed. These opening lines establish the terrible contrast that defines the entire document. A boy desperate to remain a child, while forces beyond his control demand that he become a killer. I hope Greta is being good for you, he writes. Tell her I kept my promise about the music box. It's hidden in the old oak tree behind our house, in the hollow where we used to leave messages for each other. She'll know which one. I was saving it for her birthday, but I don't think I'll be home in time. The music box reference appears 3 more times in the letter, always in contexts that suggest Klaus knows he won't survive to give it to his sister personally. The repetition reveals a child's mind struggling to process the reality of his situation while clinging to the familiar rituals of family life. Klaus joined the Hitler Youth in 1943, when membership became mandatory for all German boys over the age of 10. Initially, the organization functioned as a combination of scouting group and political indoctrination center. Boys learned outdoor skills, participated in athletic competitions, and received instruction in Nazi ideology that presented warfare as glorious adventure and death for the fatherland as the highest honor a young German could achieve. By 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated, the Hitler Youth transformed from a propaganda organization into a source of actual combatants. Boys who had been learning to tie knots and identify plants were suddenly receiving weapons training and combat instruction. The transition from playing soldier to being a soldier happened so gradually that many participants didn't recognize the change until it was too late to resist. Klaus's letter describes this transformation with the bewilderment of a child who expected to grow up slowly but found himself thrust into adulthood without warning or preparation. Last week we were still doing drills with wooden rifles, he writes. Today they handed me a real one and said the wooden ones were for babies. But I don't feel ready for a real rifle. I still feel like I should be using the wooden one. The psychological manipulation required to transform children into soldiers appears throughout Klaus's observations about his training and deployment. Adult authority figures used shame, peer pressure, and appeals to patriotic duty to overcome natural childhood reluctance to engage in violence. Boys who expressed fear or hesitation were labeled cowards and subjected to social ostracism that was devastating to adolescents desperately seeking acceptance and belonging. Hans started crying yesterday during weapons practice, Klaus writes. The sergeant made all of us march past him and call him a baby. Hans is only 12, but nobody was allowed to say that. We all had to pretend he was old enough to know better. I wanted to tell him it was okay to cry, but I was afraid they'd make me march past him too. The letter reveals how military authorities exploited normal childhood dynamics: the desire to fit in, the fear of being excluded, the need to prove maturity, to create compliance with increasingly dangerous demands. Boys who might have naturally protected each other were turned against one another through competitive dynamics that rewarded aggression and punished compassion. Klaus's descriptions of daily life in his unit provide disturbing insights into how children adapted to military environments designed for adults. The physical challenges were obvious: uniforms that didn't fit, equipment too heavy to carry comfortably, physical demands that exceeded adolescent capabilities. But the psychological challenges were more profound and lasting. "We sleep 4 to a bed now because so many beds are empty," he writes. "Nobody talks about where the other boys went. When someone asks, the officers say they were transferred to other units. But I saw them loading bodies onto trucks. I know what transferred means here. I just don't tell the younger ones." The letter documents how children created their own coping mechanisms for dealing with trauma and loss that they lacked the emotional development to process normally. Klaus and his fellow child soldiers developed elaborate systems of denial and euphemism that allowed them to function while witnessing horrors that would challenge adult comprehension. The recruitment of child soldiers accelerated dramatically in the final months of the war, as German forces faced overwhelming casualties and dwindling reserves of adult personnel. Internal Wehrmacht documents, declassified in the 1990s, reveal systematic plans to deploy boys as young as 12 in combat roles previously reserved for experienced soldiers. A memo dated February 15, 1945, from General Gotthard Heinrichs states, "The Reich's survival depends on maximum utilization of all available human resources. Age restrictions for combat deployment are hereby suspended for the duration of the current emergency. Unit commanders are authorized to arm and deploy personnel of any age capable of carrying weapons and following orders." The clinical language conceals a decision to sacrifice children for a lost cause. By early 1945, German military leaders knew the war was unwinnable, yet they continued to send boys like Klaus into combat rather than acknowledge defeat. The letter provides a child's perspective on this adult failure of moral leadership. "The officers keep saying we're going to win," Klaus writes. "They say the enemy is almost beaten and we just need to hold on a little longer. But I see their faces when they think we're not looking. They look like my father did when he had to tell us our dog was sick and wouldn't get better. They're lying to us the way adults lie to children when the truth is too scary." Klaus's ability to see through adult deception while remaining powerless to act on that knowledge captures the particular cruelty of child soldier recruitment. Children are simultaneously naive enough to be manipulated and perceptive enough to recognize the manipulation, creating psychological conflicts that can last lifetimes for survivors. The letter's most disturbing passages describe Klaus's attempts to reconcile his child's understanding of right and wrong with the moral inversions required by military service. Children naturally possess strong senses of fairness and justice, but warfare demands the suspension of normal ethical reasoning. Klaus struggles to understand how behaviors that would be criminal in civilian life, killing, destroying property, following orders without question, become virtues in military contexts. "They taught us to shoot at targets that look like people," he writes. "I kept thinking about how I'd get in trouble for pointing even a toy gun at someone at home. Now they want me to point a real gun at real people and pull the trigger. They say it's different because these people are enemies, but they look like the same people we used to see in the market. I don't understand how people can become different just because someone says they're enemies now." Klaus's confusion reveals how child soldiers are forced to abandon normal moral development in favor of artificial distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable violence. The psychological damage from this forced moral confusion often proves more lasting than physical injuries sustained in combat. The letter provides evidence of the systematic indoctrination techniques used to overcome children's natural resistance to violence. Klaus describes mandatory viewing of propaganda films that depicted enemy soldiers as subhuman monsters deserving of death. He recounts lectures about racial superiority that justified the killing of civilians. He details ceremonies that celebrated violence as patriotic duty and presented death in combat as the highest expression of German manhood. "They showed us a film about Russian soldiers eating German babies," he writes. "Everybody got really angry and wanted to fight them right away. But afterward, when I was lying in bed, I remembered that they showed us the same kind of film about the French last year, and about the English before that. I started wondering if they show films about German soldiers eating babies to Russian children. I wanted to ask someone, but I was afraid of what they might say if I did. Klaus's dawning awareness of propaganda techniques demonstrates the intelligence and critical thinking that military authorities had to suppress in order to maintain child compliance. The letter suggests that many child soldiers possessed the intellectual capacity to question their indoctrination but lacked the power or support systems necessary to act on their doubts. The document also reveals how child soldiers were isolated from civilian influences that might have provided alternative perspectives on their situation. Klaus describes the gradual cutting of ties with family, school, and community that accompanied his military service. Boys were told that civilian concerns were selfish and unpatriotic, that true Germans would sacrifice everything, including contact with loved ones, for the war effort. They say we can't write letters home anymore because it makes soldiers weak and homesick, Klaus writes. But I'm writing this one anyway. I'm hiding it with my other things, and maybe someday someone will find it and send it to you. I know I'm not supposed to miss home, but I dream about your potato soup every night. Does that make me a bad soldier? Does it make me a bad German? I don't know anymore. The prohibition on correspondence reveals how military authorities understood that maintaining family connections would undermine their control over child soldiers. By cutting boys off from their emotional support systems, they created dependencies on military structures that were easier to manipulate for combat purposes. Klaus's letter provides rare documentation of how child soldiers experienced combat itself. Most historical accounts of child military service focus on recruitment and training rather than actual battlefield experiences. Klaus's observations offer insights into how children processed the sensory and emotional overload of warfare. The noise is the worst part, he writes. It never stops. Even when the guns go quiet, your ears keep ringing so loud you can't think straight. And the smell, nobody told us about the smell. It gets in your clothes and hair, and you can't get it out no matter how much you wash. I try to remember what home smelled like, but I can't anymore. There's only this smell now. The letter documents how warfare assaults children's senses in ways that fundamentally alter their perception of the world. Klaus describes losing the ability to distinguish between dangerous and safe sounds, developing hypervigilance that made normal sleep impossible, and experiencing intrusive memories that interrupted his ability to concentrate on simple tasks. These symptoms match what modern psychology recognizes as post-traumatic stress disorder, but Klaus had no framework for understanding his psychological reactions to combat trauma. He interpreted his symptoms as personal failures rather than normal responses to abnormal experiences. I jump every time I hear a loud noise now, he writes. Even when it's just someone dropping something or a door slamming. The other boys laugh at me, but I can't help it. My body thinks everything is an explosion. Does this mean I'm becoming a coward? Will it go away when I get home? I'm scared it won't. And then you'll know that I turned into something broken in the war. Klaus's fear that combat had fundamentally damaged him reflects the lack of psychological support available to child soldiers. Military authorities provided no counseling or mental health services for traumatized children, instead treating psychological casualties as disciplinary problems requiring punishment rather than treatment. Support this work so the truth can be heard. The letter's most heartbreaking passages describe Klaus's attempts to maintain his identity as his mother's son while fulfilling his role as a soldier. He struggles to reconcile the person he was raised to be with the person military service demands he become. The conflict between these identities creates profound psychological distress that he lacks the vocabulary to express directly. Sometimes I forget who I was before I came here, he writes. I try to remember sitting at our kitchen table doing homework, or playing with Fritz in the garden, or listening to you read stories before bed. But those memories feel like they happened to someone else, like I'm remembering a movie I saw about a different boy. Am I still the same Klaus who lived in our house? Or did that Klaus die somewhere and get replaced by this soldier Klaus who doesn't know how to be your son anymore? The existential confusion Klaus expresses reflects how child-soldier recruitment disrupts normal identity formation during crucial developmental years. Adolescents naturally experiment with different aspects of their identity as they mature into adults, but the extreme demands of military service can arrest this process or channel it in destructive directions. Klaus's letter documents his attempts to preserve connection with his pre-war self through small rituals and private acts of rebellion against military conformity. He describes hiding photographs of his family inside his uniform, secretly saying prayers his mother taught him before meals, and maintaining a mental list of things he wanted to do when he returned home. "I still count sheep the way you taught me when I can't sleep," he writes. "The other boys would laugh if they knew, but it makes me feel like part of you is still with me. I pretend the sheep are jumping over the fence in our back garden, and sometimes I can almost convince myself that I'm lying in my own bed waiting for you to check on me before you go to sleep." These coping mechanisms reveal both the resilience of children and the inadequacy of such strategies for dealing with severe trauma. Klaus's attempts to maintain psychological connection with home provide temporary comfort, but cannot address the fundamental violence being done to his developing sense of self. The letter also documents Klaus's growing awareness of his own mortality and his attempts to prepare for death in ways that preserve some dignity and meaning. Unlike adult soldiers who might have years to develop philosophical frameworks for understanding sacrifice and loss, child soldiers face ultimate questions with limited life experience and incomplete emotional development. "I've been thinking about what it means to die," Klaus writes. "I know that sounds strange for someone my age, but it's hard not to think about it here. I don't want to die, but I also don't want to be afraid if it happens. Do you think dying for Germany will make God proud of me? Or do you think God would rather have me come home and be your son again? I wish I could ask Pastor Mueller, but he's probably dead too by now." Klaus's religious uncertainty reflects how warfare disrupts the spiritual frameworks that normally help people process mortality and meaning. Military authorities promoted a version of Christianity that sanctified violence and death for the state, but this ideology conflicted with the more peaceful Christian values Klaus had learned at home and church. The contradiction between military and religious ethics created additional psychological stress for child soldiers who were taught to revere both God and the fatherland without being given tools to resolve conflicts between these loyalties. Klaus's letter reveals how children attempted to navigate these contradictions without adult guidance or support. "They say Jesus wants us to kill the enemies of Germany," he writes. "But I remember you reading me stories about Jesus saying to love your enemies and turn the other cheek. I asked the chaplain about this, and he said I was too young to understand the difference between peacetime Christianity and wartime Christianity. But I think I'm old enough to know that Jesus is supposed to be the same all the time. Why would he change his mind about loving people just because there's a war?" Klaus's theological questioning demonstrates the intellectual sophistication that military authorities had to suppress in order to maintain ideological control over child soldiers. His letter suggests that children often possessed clearer moral reasoning than the adults who recruited them for military service. The document provides disturbing evidence of how child soldiers were systematically desensitized to violence through gradual exposure to increasingly extreme situations. Klaus describes a progression from watching combat footage to observing prisoner interrogations to participating in combat operations. Each step was presented as natural advancement rather than moral degradation. "First, they showed us pictures of dead soldiers and told us to study them so we'd know what to expect," he writes. "Then they brought in prisoners for us to practice interrogating. The prisoners looked scared of us, which seemed funny at first because we're just kids. But then I realized they were scared because kids can be crueler than adults. We don't always know when to stop." Klaus's recognition of children's capacity for cruelty reveals an important aspect of child soldier recruitment that is often overlooked in discussions focused on victimization. While children are clearly victims of adult manipulation, they can also become perpetrators of violence in ways that complicate simple narratives about innocence and guilt. The letter documents Klaus's growing awareness of his own capacity for violence and his horror at discovering this aspect of his personality. Unlike adult soldiers who might have some framework for understanding their violent impulses, child soldiers face these discoveries without adequate psychological preparation or support. "Yesterday, I hit a prisoner who wouldn't stop crying," he writes. "I hit him hard, and I wanted to hit him again. For a second, I felt good about making him stop crying. Then I realized what I had done and felt sick. I've never hit anyone before, not even when I was really angry. I don't know where that came from. I'm scared that I'm turning into someone who likes hurting people. Is that what war does to you? Does it make you forget how to be kind?" Klaus's self-awareness about his transformation provides evidence of the psychological damage inflicted on child soldiers who retain enough moral sensitivity to recognize their own degradation. The letter suggests that maintaining moral consciousness in military environments designed to eliminate it creates additional trauma that can persist long after physical wounds heal. The document also reveals how child soldiers developed complex relationships with their adult commanders that combined elements of parental dependency with military hierarchy. Boys desperate for adult approval and guidance in traumatic situations often formed intense emotional bonds with officers who simultaneously protected and exploited them. Klaus describes his company commander, Lieutenant Weber, in terms that reveal both admiration and confused dependency. Lieutenant Weber says, "I'm one of his best boys," he writes. "He gave me extra rations yesterday and told me I remind him of his own son. It made me feel proud, but also sad because I wondered if his son knows that his father has other sons now. Do you think you could have other sons if I don't come home? Would they be better sons than I've been?" The confused family dynamics that developed in military units reflect how child soldiers were deprived of normal parental relationships while being offered inadequate substitutes that served military rather than developmental purposes. Officers who functioned as father figures were ultimately preparing their surrogate children for death rather than life. Klaus's letter documents his attempts to maintain hope for survival and return home while simultaneously preparing for death. This psychological balancing act required enormous emotional energy and created cognitive dissonance that he struggled to resolve. "I try to plan what I'll do when I get home," he writes. "I want to finish school and maybe become a teacher like Mr. Hoffman. I want to help Greta with her piano lessons and teach Fritz new tricks. I want to sit in the kitchen while you cook and tell you everything that happened here. But then I remember that most of the boys who used to talk about going home aren't here anymore. And I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. Maybe it's easier to die if you don't really believe you're going to live anyway." Klaus's oscillation between hope and despair reflects the impossible psychological situation of child soldiers who must maintain enough optimism to function while acknowledging the reality of their circumstances. The letter reveals how children attempted to manage this contradiction through compartmentalization and selective attention. The document provides evidence of how child soldiers maintained covert resistance to their military situation even while outwardly complying with orders and expectations. Klaus describes small acts of sabotage, moments of compassion toward enemies, and preservation of civilian values despite official indoctrination. "I pretended to lose my ammunition yesterday, so I wouldn't have to shoot at the men running across the field," he writes. "I told Lieutenant Weber that my cartridges fell out during the bombardment. He believed me because I'm usually careful with my equipment. But really I threw them away because those men looked like they were running home to their families. I couldn't be the one to stop them from getting there." Klaus's passive resistance reveals the moral agency that children retained even in highly coercive military environments. His letter suggests that many child soldiers found ways to preserve their humanity through small acts of kindness and refusal that went undetected by their commanders. These acts of resistance were psychologically important for maintaining some sense of personal autonomy and moral identity. Klaus's ability to choose compassion over compliance, even in minor ways, provided him with evidence that he remained capable of independent moral reasoning despite systematic attempts to eliminate such capacity. The letter's tone becomes increasingly urgent as Klaus apparently realizes that his situation is becoming desperate. His handwriting becomes less careful, his sentences shorter, his observations more immediate and visceral. The change in style suggests that he wrote different sections of the letter over several days as his circumstances deteriorated. "The Russians are getting closer," he writes. "We can hear their guns now even when there's no fighting. Lieutenant Weber says we're going to make a last stand here in the city. He says it will be glorious and that our families will be proud of us. But I don't think my family wants me to be glorious. I think they just want me to come home." Klaus's rejection of military glory in favor of family reunion represents a fundamental resistance to the value system that military authorities tried to impose on child soldiers. His letter prioritizes love over honor, survival over sacrifice, human connection over abstract patriotic duty. This value orientation remained constant throughout Klaus's military service despite intensive indoctrination efforts. His letter suggests that family bonds and basic human attachments proved more durable than military ideology, at least for some child soldiers who retained emotional connections with their pre-war lives. The document's final passages reveal Klaus's growing awareness that he is unlikely to survive the war's end. His tone becomes more reflective as he attempts to summarize his experiences and provide some final accounting of his life and choices. "I don't think I was a very good soldier," he writes. "I was scared most of the time, and I didn't really want to hurt anybody. I tried to follow orders, but my heart wasn't in it. Maybe that makes me a bad German, but I think it makes me still your son. I'd rather be your son than a good soldier anyway." Klaus's final assessment of his military service prioritizes family identity over national identity, personal relationships over political abstractions. His choice to define himself as his mother's son rather than as a German soldier represents a fundamental rejection of the military's attempt to reshape his core identity. The letter concludes with Klaus's attempts to provide comfort for his mother while acknowledging that she will likely never read his words. This selfless concern for his mother's emotional well-being in the face of his own impending death reveals the moral sophistication that military authorities failed to eliminate despite their intensive efforts. "If you never get this letter, I hope you'll always remember me the way I was before I left home," he writes. "Remember me doing homework at the kitchen table, or playing piano badly while Greta laughed at my mistakes, or helping you hang laundry in the garden. Don't try to imagine me as a soldier because I was never really one. I was always just Klaus who missed his mama and wanted to come home. Subscribe to ensure these forbidden stories don't disappear again." Klaus's final words return to the image that opened the letter. "They gave me a rifle bigger than me. I never learned how to use it properly because I spent too much time thinking about the music box I hid for Greta. Maybe that makes me a failure as a soldier, but I think it makes me still human. Tell Greta I love her. Tell her the music box is waiting for her. And so am I, somewhere beyond all this noise and smoke and sadness." The letter was discovered in 2021 by Dr. Elena Richter, a historian researching civilian casualties in the final days of the Battle of Berlin. She found it inside a metal box buried beneath the rubble of a destroyed building in what had been the city's government district. The box also contained Klaus's military identification, a small photograph of his family, and the key to a music box. Authentication proved challenging because few records survived from Klaus's unit, which was apparently disbanded and its members killed or captured in the war's final weeks. However, genealogical research located Klaus's sister Greta, now in her 80s and living in Munich. She confirmed details from the letter and provided additional family photographs that supported its authenticity. Greta's reaction to reading her brother's letter 76 years after his death provides insight into the lasting trauma experienced by families who lost children to military service. "I always wondered what happened to Klaus," she said in an interview. "My parents told me he died as a hero, but I just wanted to know if he thought about us at the end. Now I know he did, but I also know he suffered in ways that no child should ever suffer." The discovery of Klaus's letter has contributed to growing historical awareness of child soldier recruitment during World War II. Researchers estimate that Germany deployed between 100,000 and 200,000 children under the age of 16 in combat roles during the war's final years. Most of these children left no written records of their experiences, making Klaus's testimony particularly valuable for understanding their psychological and emotional experiences. Modern psychological research on child soldiers in contemporary conflicts has provided frameworks for understanding Klaus's experiences that were not available to his contemporaries. Studies of child combatants in Africa, Asia, and Latin America reveal consistent patterns of psychological damage that match Klaus's self-descriptions in his letter. Dr. Michael Chun, a psychologist who specializes in child trauma, explains, "Klaus's letter documents classic symptoms of what we now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder in children. The moral injury he describes, being forced to violate his basic values and identity, is one of the most difficult forms of trauma to treat, even in adult populations. For children, it can be devastating to long-term psychological development." The letter has been incorporated into educational programs designed to raise awareness about contemporary child soldier recruitment, which remains a significant problem in many parts of the world. Klaus's words provide historical context for understanding how children experience military exploitation and help illustrate the lasting damage caused by involving minors in armed conflict. Human rights organizations have used Klaus's testimony to support international efforts to prevent child soldier recruitment and to assist in the rehabilitation of children who have been forced to participate in armed conflicts. His letter demonstrates the importance of preserving children's psychological connection to family and civilian identity even in military environments. The document has also influenced legal developments related to war crimes prosecution. International criminal courts have increasingly recognized the recruitment and deployment of child soldiers as a serious war crime deserving of prosecution and punishment. Klaus's letter provides evidence of the psychological damage caused by such recruitment that can be used in contemporary legal proceedings. The letter's publication has prompted additional research into the experiences of child soldiers throughout history. Scholars have begun examining similar documents from other conflicts to develop more comprehensive understanding of how children experience and remember military service. This research has revealed that Klaus's experiences were not unique to Nazi Germany, but reflect broader patterns of child exploitation that appear in many different cultural and historical contexts. The psychological mechanisms he describes, indoctrination, isolation from family, gradual desensitization to violence, appear consistently in accounts of child soldiers from various conflicts around the world. The universality of these patterns suggests that Klaus's letter provides insights relevant beyond its specific historical context. His testimony helps illuminate the psychological processes through which adults transform children into instruments of violence, regardless of the particular ideological or political motivations involved. The letter has also contributed to discussions about historical memory and the representation of children in war narratives. Traditional military histories often minimize or romanticize the involvement of minors in armed conflicts, focusing on their courage and patriotism rather than their victimization and psychological damage. Klaus's letter challenges these romanticized narratives by providing unfiltered testimony about the reality of child military service. His words reveal the cognitive and emotional immaturity that made children vulnerable to exploitation while simultaneously documenting their moral sophistication and capacity for independent thought. The document forces readers to confront uncomfortable questions about adult responsibility for protecting children during conflicts. Klaus's letter reveals how military authorities systematically violated their duty of care toward minors in their charge, prioritizing military effectiveness over child welfare. These violations were not accidental byproducts of wartime chaos, but deliberate policy decisions made by adults who understood the psychological cost of their actions. Internal military documents reveal that commanders were aware of the trauma they were inflicting on child soldiers, but considered such damage acceptable given military necessities. Klaus's letter provides evidence that children recognized and resisted these violations of their welfare, even when they lacked power to prevent them. His testimony reveals the moral clarity that military authorities had to actively suppress in order to maintain control over child soldiers. The letter's preservation and eventual discovery also highlight the importance of protecting historical documents that provide evidence of war crimes and human rights violations. Klaus's testimony survived because he took deliberate steps to hide it from military authorities who would have destroyed it if discovered. Similar documents may remain hidden in archives, private collections, or buried locations around the world. Klaus's letter demonstrates the historical value of such materials and the importance of efforts to locate and preserve testimony from victims of military exploitation. The document has inspired new approaches to historical research that prioritize victim testimony and marginalized voices over official military records. Klaus's letter provides perspectives on World War II that are absent from traditional sources focused on strategy, tactics, and political decision-making. This victim-centered approach to historical research has revealed aspects of warfare that are often overlooked in conventional military histories. Klaus's letter illustrates how focusing on individual experiences can illuminate broader patterns of abuse and exploitation that statistical analysis alone cannot capture. The letter has also influenced contemporary discussions about the age of military recruitment and the rights of minors in military contexts. Many countries continue to recruit soldiers under the age of 18, though most prohibit their deployment in combat situations. Klaus's testimony provides historical evidence for arguments that any military recruitment of minors constitutes a form of abuse, regardless of whether children are deployed in combat roles. His letter documents how military training itself can cause psychological damage to children who lack the emotional development to process its demands. International human rights organizations have cited Klaus's letter in campaigns to raise the minimum age for military recruitment to 18 worldwide. His testimony provides compelling evidence of the harm caused by involving children in military institutions, even in non-combat capacities. The letter's impact extends beyond policy discussions to influence artistic and cultural representations of warfare and childhood. Klaus's words have been incorporated into theatrical productions, documentary films, and literary works that attempt to convey the human cost of armed conflict. These artistic interpretations help make Klaus's testimony accessible to audiences who might not engage with historical documents directly. His letter provides raw material for creative works that can reach broader audiences and generate emotional responses that purely factual presentations might not achieve. The document has also influenced educational approaches to teaching about World War II and historical trauma more generally. Klaus's letter provides a concrete example of how large historical forces affected individual lives, making abstract concepts like militarization and indoctrination more comprehensible to students. Teachers have found that Klaus's testimony generates stronger emotional engagement and critical thinking than traditional textbook accounts of the war's end. His letter helps students understand warfare as a human rather than purely political phenomenon. The letter's continued relevance reflects its author's success in preserving his voice across the decades. Klaus wrote his letter hoping that someone would eventually find it and understand what he had experienced. His words have indeed reached audiences he could never have imagined, speaking to concerns and conflicts he could not have anticipated. The document serves as a bridge between historical memory and contemporary consciousness, connecting past suffering with present understanding. Klaus's testimony provides evidence that individual voices can survive even systematic attempts to silence them if someone takes responsibility for preserving and sharing their words. His letter demonstrates the power of simple human testimony to transcend political manipulation and ideological distortion. Klaus's unadorned account of his experiences carries moral authority that cannot be diminished by time or reinterpreted by those with different agendas. The letter's final passage returns to the central image that defines the entire document. They gave me a rifle bigger than me, but I never stopped being small enough to fit in my mother's arms. That's what I want to remember when everything else fades away. Not the weight of the rifle, but the feeling of being held and safe and loved. Maybe that's what growing up should really mean. Getting big enough to hold other people the way your mother held you, not big enough to carry weapons designed to hurt them. These words capture the fundamental choice between love and violence that Klaus faced throughout his military service. His decision to prioritize family bonds over military loyalty represents a form of resistance that no amount of indoctrination could eliminate. Klaus's voice echoes across the decades, carrying its burden of innocence destroyed and wisdom gained through suffering. His letter serves as testimony to the resilience of human compassion even in environments designed to eliminate it. The document reminds us that behind every historical statistic about child soldiers stands a specific individual with a name, a family, and a story. Klaus Hoffman was not merely a casualty of Germany's military desperation but a complete human being whose life was cut short by adult failures of moral leadership. His letter preserves the memory of a boy who loved his sister enough to hide a music box for her birthday, who missed his mother's cooking more than he feared enemy bullets, who chose kindness over cruelty even when cruelty was rewarded and kindness was punished. Klaus's words survive as evidence that some truths are too important to be buried, some voices too urgent to be silenced, and some stories too necessary to be forgotten. His letter serves as proof that children's testimony deserves to be heard and preserved, not dismissed as naive or irrelevant to serious historical inquiry. Children's letters survive longer than empires, but they speak quietly, if we learn how to listen.